The light is going now. You are standing, or imagine that you are, in a room that was once well ordered and assured. The plaster on the walls is still smooth in places, still painted in faded ochre and red. A mosaic covers part of the floor beneath your feet, a vine tendril, a fish, a border of interlocking chevrons. Someone spent weeks laying those stones. Through the window opening you can see a courtyard gone a little ragged at the edges, weeds coming up between the paving slabs, a gate that hasn't been repainted in some years. It is late afternoon in Britain, somewhere around the year 410, and the old world is not ending dramatically. It is simply growing quieter. Tonight, let yourself drift back across 1,000 years of this island's life. You'll pass through the slow dissolve of Roman Britain into the smoky timber halls of the earliest English settlers, through the centuries when Viking longships appeared on grey northern horizons and the fields of the Danelaw carried Norse names alongside English ones. You'll feel the shudder of the Norman conquest from ground level. A new lord, a new language, a new castle on the hill. And then the long, ordinary rhythm of the feudal manor, the church bells measuring out the day, the market towns filling up with noise and mud and possibility. You'll sit beside a village hearth through plague years, through the long French wars, through the weary dynastic struggles that closed the medieval age and gave way, almost without ceremony, to something new. All of it ground level. All of it quiet. History, when it reaches the people who actually lived it, is mostly texture. The smell of fresh bread at a market stall, the weight of a plough in clay soil, the sound of wind across open fields after dark. Let that be enough tonight. Let it carry you gently toward rest. The last of the afternoon light is fading over that Romano-British courtyard. Step inside before the cold comes in. The room you step into is a kitchen, or what served as one. There is a hearth at the centre, low and wide, and the smoke has been finding its own way out through a hole in the roof for some years now because the Hippocaust. The underfloor heating system, a modest luxury that once made this house something to be proud of, went out months ago and no one has come to service it. The clay pipes that distributed warm air beneath the tiled floors are still there, still intact, but cold. The household has moved its daily life into this one central room. It is warmer here and smaller, and somehow that feels right. You settle onto a low wooden bench near the hearth. The bench is worn smooth at the seat from years of use, the grain of the oak raised along the edges where hands have gripped it. On the shelf above, a few clay pots with their lids on, one holding dried beans, one holding salt, one holding a little rendered fat. A string of dried herbs hangs from a roof timber, thyme and something bitter, and when the fire shifts, the smoke catches their smell and releases it into the room. The bread from this morning is wrapped in cloth on the table, still half a loaf. You will eat it with the beans tonight, and it will be enough. You are not a person of great consequence. Your family has lived on this land for generations, farming a few acres of good British soil, paying your dues to an estate owner who paid his dues upward through a chain of Roman administration that stretched, in theory, all the way to Ravenna. That chain is fraying now. The estate owner left some time ago, called back or simply gone, and the administrative apparatus that once collected taxes, maintained the road, and settled disputes at the local court has grown thin in ways that are hard to describe precisely. It isn't that one day the lights went out. It is that every year there is slightly less of all of it. The coins in the small pottery jar on the shelf are worth less than they were. You know this in a vague way, that when you take them to market, the man with the grain will look at them for a moment before accepting them, and sometimes suggest a direct trade instead. Barter is coming back. Not in any way that makes noise, not with ceremony or collapse, just quietly, the way a habit returns when the alternative becomes unreliable. You have more grain than coins now, and more grain feels like the safer thing to have. Historians still dispute whether the towns of Roman Britain emptied slowly, generation by generation, or whether some places saw a sharper, faster abandonment, a decade of decline rather than a century of it. The archaeology is patchy. What it shows, more or less, is that urban life in many places was already contracting well before the year 410, when the Emperor Honorius sent word to the Britons that they should look to their own defences. The legions had been leaving in waves for decades, pulled to more pressing fronts on the continent. The administrators and tax collectors thinned out. Think of yourself standing in that quieter forum, watching it happen in slow motion. And the infrastructure, the roads, the aqueducts, the heated bathhouses, the coin-minting operations. All of it requires not just money, but an organized system of specialists to keep running, and that system was dissolving. Now picture yourself walking into town on a market day. Not a large town, but a real one. A grid of streets, a forum, a few public buildings whose facades are still imposing even if the stone has weathered. The street you walk down is rutted. A section of cobbling has been lifted and not replaced. Someone needed the stone for something else. There are fewer stalls than there used to be. You can remember, or your father can remember, when this forum was full on market day, noisy, the air thick with smoke and voices and the smell of hot food. Now it is quieter. Not abandoned, not ghostly, just smaller. The people who are here go about their business with the particular focus of those who have stopped expecting things to be as they were. You stop at the grain stall and pay with coin, and the man holds it up a moment in the weak autumn light, turning it between his fingers. He accepts it, but he says nothing, and neither do you. You buy salt too, a small cloth packet, the salt damp and grey and precious, and a handful of dried fish from a woman at the far end of the row. The fish smells strongly of brine and smoke. You wrap it in the corner of your cloak for the walk home. The buildings at the town's further edge have started to be used for storage, or for animals, or simply left. Saplings have come up in one courtyard. Inside a house whose owner moved away or died, the roof has partially given in, and a drift of last autumn's leaves has collected on the mosaic floor, that distinctive, civilized floor, and begun to rot down into soil. The little stone dog that once stood on a pedestal inside the entrance lies on its side in the weeds, one ear chipped off. You pass it without stopping. You have walked this way before, and it always looks slightly worse than the time before. Back at your own farm, the day has a shape that Rome gave you, and that you have kept even as Rome itself recedes. You plant when the season says to plant. You work the fields in strips, sharing labour with your neighbours as you always have. The wheat and barley come up as they always have. Your hands know the work. They are thickened at the knuckles from years of it, the palms calloused in the same pattern your fathers were, the same pattern you see in the hands of every man and woman in the settlement. There is still a local landowner, a man whose family has been here for a long time, who speaks both Latin and something older, the language the towns always called British, that people in the hills never stop speaking. And he collects what he is owed from the harvest and settles the occasional dispute and is the closest thing to order that you have. You work for him in exchange for the land you farm. The arrangement is ancient and will outlast Rome by centuries. The tools are simple: an iron-tipped plough, a heavy mattock, a sickle whose blade you have sharpened so many times the original shape is almost gone. The iron came from somewhere, a smith in the town who got it from a merchant who got it from further away, and the network that supplied it is getting quieter too. When this sickle blade finally goes, you are not certain there will be another. You will keep it sharp long past the point of reason. The harvest this year was reasonable. Not abundant, but sufficient. Enough wheat to set aside seed grain for next spring, enough barley for the household's bread, and a portion over to pay what is owed, enough stored in the granary pit to get through to March if the winter is not too hard. You dug the pit yourself, lined it with woven straw, sealed it with a clay cap. Grain stored this way will keep its germination for 2 or 3 years if the seal holds. You check it before winter closes in, pressing your hand against the clay, looking for cracks where damp might enter. The work of keeping is as important as the work of growing. Water is the other labour that never stops. The well in the courtyard is old, Roman built, its stone coping worn glassy where hands have rested on it for generations, and it still gives good water, cold and slightly chalky, the taste of the local limestone. You carry it in clay jugs to the kitchen, to the animals, to wherever it is needed. In summer the well drops and you watch it anxiously. In winter the bucket rope stiffens with ice and you breathe into your hands before gripping it. The water is always there and always requires the same effort, season after season, year after year, and you do not think of it as labour because it has never been anything other than this. The faith is complicated now. There is a small church in town, built within the last generation, and a priest who says the Christian offices and baptizes the children. But at the edge of your field there is a small stone that everyone knows was always there, always had a presence, and that women still leave offerings beside in certain seasons. The gods are not sorted out yet. You hold both, lightly, without much contradiction. You sleep under the same stars your grandparents slept under and pray to whatever will listen. The nights are long. Candles are expensive and used sparingly. A single tallow dip, the smell of it fatty and faint, burns in the corner while you eat. After dark, the household settles around the hearth and the talk slows and then stops, and sleep comes early because the morning will come early too. The children are already asleep on their straw, a rough blanket pulled up to their chins, their breathing slow and even. You watch them for a moment from across the room. The fire settles lower. Picture the evening as it actually is. Close, warm, smelling of smoke and beans, and the faint sweetness of hay from the sleeping area. The roof above you is low and dark, and the rafters have blackened over years of fire smoke. A piece of wool cloth hangs over the window gap to keep the cold out, and the single tallow flame throws everything into orange and deep shadow. Your wife is spinning near the hearth, the drop spindle turning slowly, the thread pulling out from the raw fleece in her left hand. The sound of it is quiet, a soft, rhythmic weight. She does this most evenings because cloth is never enough and thread is always needed. The spindle hall, a small disc of fired clay, smooth and round, spins and slows and spins again. You watch it for a while, and the watching is restful, and outside the wind moves through the trees at the field's far end, and the fire is warm, and the darkness beyond the door is simply the darkness. In the distance. Not every night, but some nights, enough nights to make the anxiety a steady thing in the back of your chest. There is the knowledge of raiders on the coast. You are not near enough to the sea to hear them. But you have heard stories, and the stories have a particular quality. They are not getting fewer. The men who come in boats from across the eastern sea, Saxons, some people call them, though the word covers more than one kind of stranger, have been raiding the coastal settlements for decades. There are military men still stationed along the shore, at forts built specifically to watch for these raids, and for now the roads east are still reasonably safe. But reasonably and still are doing a lot of work in that sentence, and you know it. What you can see, standing in your courtyard at dusk, is a world that is intact but quieter than it used to be. The road at the edge of your land runs straight and Roman engineered toward the distant town, and it is still usable, still a good road. But there is less traffic on it than there was. The merchants who used to come through with goods from other parts of the province come less often. The tiles on your villa's roof were made in a workshop 40 miles away and carried here by a distribution network that required money and organization and reliable demand. And none of those things are quite what they were. You don't have a word for the age you are living through. You are just living through it. The plastered walls are still mostly smooth. The mosaic is still beautiful, though you've grown so used to it you barely see it anymore. Your children play on it in the afternoons, and the little fish under their feet are quite worn now in the middle. What is dissolving is not everything at once. The Latin names in the church records will linger for generations. The straight roads will outlast the empire by 1,000 years, and beyond. The Christian faith, which arrived late in this island and was just getting settled, will not leave at all. The land itself, its patterns of field and farm, the water meadows, the woods coppiced for timber, the clay-heavy midland soils, will hold the memory of how people worked it long after the people who worked it are gone. But the hypocaust stays cold. The forum empties out. The coins pile up in the jar, and no one is quite sure what they are worth. Outside, the dusk thickens over the fields. The barley is in. The animals are in. The hearth is the warmest place in the world, and you settle beside it. Tomorrow there will be work. There always is. For now, the light is low and the room is warm enough, and the world outside can wait until morning. 2 or 3 generations have passed. The villa you knew is still there, structurally, its walls standing, its floor still intact under a layer of leaf litter and blown soil. But no one lives in it now. A family of newcomers has built their own house perhaps 100 yards away. A low, rectangular structure, its walls woven from hazel withies and daubed with a mixture of clay and straw and animal hair. The roof is steep and thickly thatched, and it comes down almost to the ground at the eaves. From inside, the roof is a dim canopy of rafters and darkness. The floor is the earth, packed hard. This is where you live now. You wake before full light. The hearth is in the centre of the room, a shallow pit lined with stones, and the fire from last night has banked down to orange embers beneath a skin of pale ash. You are lying on a straw-filled sack raised slightly on a low timber frame, and you are not cold. The house is small enough that the heat from the fire and from the animals in the byre at the end of the building has held through the night. You can hear the ox shifting in there, the rustle of its breath in the half-dark. You push back the wool blanket. It is rough against your skin, undyed, smelling of lanolin and wood smoke, and it is the warmest thing you own. The straw in your mattress has been changed this autumn, cut fresh from the field and dried, and it still has a faint green sweetness under the older smell of use. You dress quickly, linen shirt first, then a longer wool tunic belted at the waist, then foot wrappings of thick cloth wound up to the knee. The leather shoes are by the door where you left them, and they are slightly damp from yesterday. You put them on anyway. You are Anglo-Saxon, or close enough to it. The word covers a great deal. Angles from what is now the border country of Denmark and northern Germany, Saxons from further south along the continent's coast, Jutes from the Jutland Peninsula. They came at different times, some as raiders, some as settlers invited in. There is a tradition of British leaders hiring Germanic warriors as federates, just as Rome had done for centuries, and some simply as families looking for land. The east of Britain, then the Midlands, then further west. Over the course of the 5th and 6th centuries, the new culture took hold, rooting itself in the river valleys and the lower slopes and the good agricultural ground. Scholars still debate how much of this was displacement and how much was gradual absorption, whether the Britons who had farmed these fields fled or died, or simply learned new names and new customs over time. The answer is probably all of those, unevenly, across different regions and different centuries. What is clear is that by the time you wake in your wattle and daub house, something recognisably English has begun. Now, though, the morning is waiting. You step outside into grey, early light. The settlement is a cluster of houses. Call it a hamlet, 8 or 10 households, grouped loosely around a shared open area. The ground is muddy from last night's rain, and the air carries that clean, cold earthiness, layered under the older note of wood smoke and the ammoniac warmth from the livestock. Someone else is already up. You can see a thread of smoke from the house 2 doors down, and the sound of grain being ground, a slow, rhythmic thud that will go on for half an hour before the day's porridge is ready. Barley porridge. It will be barley porridge again, with perhaps a scraping of butter if the cow gave well, and if you are lucky there will be yesterday's bread heel to go with it. The bread is heavy and dark and tastes of the smoke it was baked in. The flour it was made from was ground on a rotary quern, 2 flat stones turned by hand. Slow work, arm-aching work, the kind you do in the early dark while the children still sleep. And the bread carries traces of grit from the millstone in its crumb. You eat it standing because there is work to begin. The work is the fields. There are strips of open farmland around the settlement, and your household has rights to a number of them, interleaved with your neighbours' strips in the way that keeps the good and bad ground distributed fairly. The exact arrangement will shift over the generations, but the principle, shared land, scattered holdings, is already taking shape. You take your turn working the shared ground, you keep your own strips, and the whole thing is bound together by obligation, custom, and the memory of who owns what, all held in human heads because paper records are not yet part of this life. The ox is the heart of it. Getting the plough through clay soil in November requires a real ox, patient and enormous, and the ox is carefully managed. Fed through winter on hay cut from the water meadows in summer, rested when the ground is too hard, kept in out of the worst cold. The harness is checked daily, the leather rubbed with fat to keep it from cracking. The plough iron is kept sharp. You can feel the difference in a field when it drags even slightly. A village without oxen is a village in serious difficulty, and everyone knows it. The plough itself is a heavy thing of ash and iron, and it takes 2 people to manage on the heavier ground. 1 to hold the handles and lean into it, 1 to lead the ox. You take turns at both. The furrows go in long straight lines as much as the ground allows, and the turned earth is dark and dense, that mineral cold clay scent filling your throat all morning and coating the inside of your nose until it is still there at supper. By midday your shoulders ache through to the bone. You stop at the headland, let the ox rest, eat a piece of hard cheese and a handful of dried beans from the cloth you brought, drink cold water from the skin. It is not enough to not be hungry, but it is what there is. The vegetable plot behind the house is yours to manage more freely. Leeks, onions, cabbage, a little patch of flax whose stems you will ret in the pond this autumn and beat into fibre for thread. The flax work is long and smelly. The retting pond takes on a particular richness, but the thread that comes from it is what your clothes are made of, and without it there are no clothes. Nothing in this life comes from nowhere. Everything requires a chain of work you do yourself. The timber hall on the near side of the settlement belongs to the man who holds this land from the Lord above him. A chain that goes up, eventually, to a king, though the king is a distant figure, more real as a concept than as a person you would ever see. Your immediate superior is here, a few hundred yards away, and his hall is the largest building you know. It is longer and wider than the other houses, its ridgepole higher, its walls sturdier. Inside, the benches along the walls are where his household and his fighting men sleep. The fire runs down the centre of the hall in a long trench, and the smoke finds its way to the roof in a way that seems imprecise but works well enough. He is sometimes called the loaf ward, your lord. The word, in its oldest form, means the guardian of the loaf, the keeper of the bread. That tells you something about how the relationship is understood. He provides, you produce, he protects, you fight if called. On feast days, his hall is the centre of the world. Mead is passed in a great communal cup, the benches full of men whose faces are orange in the firelight, and the scop, the bard, the keeper of stories, sits near the fire and recites verses that have been passed down long enough that no one remembers their beginning. The stories are old ones, warriors and monsters, voyages over cold water, loyalty tested and found sufficient. They go slowly, with a rhythm that the body can lean into and rest. You sit in the warm hall and the mead is sweet and the stories wash over you and the night outside is very large and very dark, and this is enough. The old gods are still present in the names of things. The days of the week carry Woden and Thunor and Frigg in them, names that will outlast the people who believed in them by more than 1,000 years, still there every time anyone says Wednesday or Thursday or Friday. But the new faith is coming in. In 597, a Roman monk named Augustine arrived in Kent with a mission from the Pope and the King of Kent, who had a Frankish Christian wife and was already curious, received him, and the conversion of the pagan Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began in earnest. Somewhere in that tide of change, your household is making its own quiet reckoning. Not all at once. Slowly, with reversals. A king converted and his son did not, then his grandson did. The new faith and the old traditions lived alongside each other in a long, tangled negotiation. What you know is this: there is now a small church built of timber in the nearest larger settlement, a day's walk away. You have been baptized. Your children will be baptized. The priest who came through last spring spoke a little of what comes after this life, and you listened carefully, because what comes after this life is something worth knowing. You kept your small carved figure in the corner of the house for a while longer. Eventually you moved it to the midden. But slowly, slowly. The faith the missionaries brought did not demand that you forget how to farm or change the shape of your house or stop telling the old stories in the hall. It layered itself over what was already there, the way the new language layered itself over the older one. Some things absorbed, some things gently pushed aside, some things persisting unchanged beneath the surface for centuries. The seasons still govern you without exception. Lammers, the harvest feast in August, when the first loaf baked from the new grain is brought to the church and the whole settlement feels the relief of it together. The long still days of summer when the light lasts until well past supper and the children are still outside in the warm dusk. The heavy work of haymaking in June, all the settlement out on the water meadow, the scythes going in long, slow arcs, the cut grass lying in windows that you turn and turn until it dries enough to carry. And then the shutting in of November, when the animals come indoors and the family gathers tightly around the fire and the dark comes early and hard. November is when the slaughtering happens. The animals that cannot be fed through winter are killed now, the older pigs, the weaker sheep, and the meat is salted down in big earthenware crocks or smoked over the fire until it is preserved enough to last. The smell of it, blood and salt and wood smoke, fills the whole settlement for a week. The work is hard and cold, your hands red and stiff, But the crocks full of salted pork at the back of the house are a kind of insurance that lets you breathe a little easier as the dark months close in. The year is a wheel, and you are fixed to it. You are standing in your field in late afternoon, the work done for today, the light going golden low over the stubble. The settlement behind you is a cluster of brown roofs and wood smoke. Beyond it, your Lord's Hall, its ridgepole just visible above the tree line. Further still, to the north, the country opens out toward the great grey flatlands where the rivers widen into estuaries and the land becomes uncertain. Somewhere between land and sea, a shifting border of reed and mudflat and cold tidal water. You don't look north with fear, not exactly. Not yet. But there are stories coming down from further north, from men who trade wool for silver and sometimes hear things. Stories about ships. About a new kind of ship, very fast, built for open water, that appears on grey mornings without warning and is gone before anyone can mount a response. The men in those ships are Northmen, people from the cold lands across the North Sea, and the stories say they do not come to trade. The first raids were far away from here. A place called Lindisfarne, an island monastery off the Northumbrian coast, struck in the summer of 793 by men who came from the sea and were gone by nightfall. You've heard about it the way you hear about things, imperfectly, filtered through second and third hands, the details not quite reliable. But the shape of it is clear enough. Your children are inside. The ox is in the byre. The fire will be lit when you get home, and the barley porridge is waiting. For now, the horizon is just horizon. The light is going. The day is done. But somewhere on that grey northern water, though you cannot see it, a sail is moving. Picture yourself standing in a field, early morning, a late summer mist still clinging to the low ground. The village behind you is quiet. The thatched rooftops barely visible through the haze, a thread of smoke rising from the hall where the bread was set near the coals the night before. The sea is perhaps 2 days' walk east. You know this because the older people in the village have always known it, the way you know where the forest thins or where the creek runs shallow enough to ford. The sea has always been there, distant and irrelevant to the rhythm of sowing and harvest. Then, one morning sometime in the late 700s, the sea stops being irrelevant. The first reports would have come as rumour. A monastery burned on a rocky island far up the northern coast, monks killed or taken, everything of value stripped and carried away. The place was called Lindisfarne, and the year was 793. For people living in a village in Mercia or East Anglia, it would have seemed impossibly remote at first, a tragedy at the far edge of the world. But the raids kept coming. They came in spring and summer, when the longships could cross without drowning their crews. They came up the rivers, the Humber, the Ouse, the Thames, reaching far inland, further than anyone had thought possible. The sea was no longer irrelevant. The sea had grown teeth. You might wake one morning to a neighbour hammering at your door, breathless, saying they were seen at the river mouth. What you did next depended entirely on where you lived and how much warning you had. You might pack what you could carry and move inland. You might trust the then's haul to hold if there was a then worth trusting. You might do nothing because there was nowhere to go and the harvest was only half in. Now picture what the fear actually felt like in the body. You have spent your whole life gauging weather by the smell of the air, measuring the day by the height of the light above the tree line, reading danger by the way dogs behave at the edge of the yard. The fear of a Viking raid was different from the fear of a bad harvest or a sick cow. Those were familiar shapes, known to your hands. This fear had no familiar shape. It came from the direction you had never needed to watch. People began to dig pits under their floors to hide grain. They wrapped the few silver pennies they owned in cloth and pressed them into the earth under the threshold stone. Some of those buried hoards were never reclaimed, which is how we know about them. A man who could have gone back and dug up his coins did not go back, or could not, and the coins stayed dark in the ground for 1,000 years. Press your hands flat against the earth for a moment. Feel the cold of it, the weight of it, and let that image settle, something buried in haste, and then silence over it for 10 centuries. The fear was real, and it stayed real for generations. But here is the thing about 100 years of raids and settlements and counter-raids and negotiated boundaries. It is not only fear. People adapt. They trade. They intermarry. They learn each other's words. By the latter half of the 9th century, the picture had changed in ways that would have astonished anyone living in 793. Whole swathes of northern and eastern England had passed into Danish hands, not by any single act of conquest, but by a long accumulation of settlement, agreement, and the simple weight of people. The area came to be known as the Danelaw, a broad arc from roughly the line of the Thames and the Lea, up through East Anglia and the East Midlands and into Yorkshire and beyond. If you had been born inside it, you would have grown up hearing Danish words for ordinary things: sky, shore, neighbour, not as foreign sounds, but as the sounds of your own childhood. Inside it, Danish custom held. Danish weights and measures, Danish legal conventions, Danish land tenure patterns. Now imagine you are a farmer in that region, working land that your grandfather worked, in a village that your grandfather knew by a different name. The village might now end in by. Derby, Grimsby, Whitby, a Danish word meaning simply farm or settlement. Or it might end in Thorpe, meaning an outlying farmstead, a smaller place carved out of the margins. Your neighbours across the field might be men whose grandfathers came across the sea with an axe and a willingness to stay. They speak a language that sounds enough like your own that you can mostly follow it, the way you can almost understand a man from 3 counties away if he speaks slowly. Some of his words have slipped into your speech without your noticing. The Danish words are practical ones, words for the sky, for the shore, for the things you do with your hands. You herd the same sheep. You plant the same fields in the same rhythm. At harvest, you very likely work beside each other, because a harvest is too urgent for anyone to stand on principle. Stand in the farmyard for a moment and notice what is around you. The long-handled iron sickle hanging on the post by the byre gate is a tool your father used and his father before him, but the name your neighbour calls it. The sound he makes when he picks it up is slightly different from yours, and neither of you quite agrees on which syllable carries the weight. The byre itself is low, its walls of wattle packed with clay daub that you repatched again at the end of summer, pressing the new clay in with your palms. Inside, 2 cows stand close together, their breath rising in small clouds in the morning cold. The smell of dung and warm hide and the faint sweetness of old hay is the smell of safety. It means the animals came through the night and the meat and milk are still yours. You fork straw under their hooves because straw is what you have. The hay must last until March and you are already counting bales. The Danish settlers were, in their daily lives, farmers. Farmers who had raided, yes, or whose fathers had, or whose uncles had. But by the time they were ploughing and planting in Lincolnshire, they were ploughing and planting. They needed what all farmers need: good soil, reliable rain, a safe place to store grain, a market to sell what they grew. And markets began to revive. Picture the silver penny passing from your palm to a merchant's hand across a trestle table piled with bolts of cloth. 2 men who share almost no language, but both understand the weight of the coin. York, the old Roman city, called Jorvik by the Danes, who controlled it through much of the 9th and 10th centuries, became a trading town of genuine size. Craftsmen set up along its narrow streets. Amber came in from the Baltic. Silk came in from further than most people could name. A farmer walking into Jorvik to sell a load of grain would have heard 3 languages before he reached the market stall. Picture yourself making that walk to market. It is perhaps 6 miles, and you have been walking since first light, a sack of rye across one shoulder and a pair of live chickens tied at the ankles in your other hand. The birds complain the whole way. By the time you reach the outer streets of the town, your shoulder is raw under the sack and your feet are wet through the leather seams of your shoes. The smell of the town is different from the village, denser, sharper, an overlay of wood smoke and river water, and something chemical from the tannery 2 streets over where hides are steeped in oak bark liquor. You sell the rye. You sell one of the chickens. You buy a small cone of salt wrapped in cloth because the salt supply at home is running low and winter is 4 months off. You start walking back before midday because the road through the wood is not a place to be after dark. Alfred, the King of Wessex, that kingdom in the south and west that the Danes had not managed to absorb, negotiated a line in the 870s and 880s. His kingdom on one side, the Danelaw on the other. He built fortified towns called burhs strung across the landscape, not just royal strongholds, but places where ordinary people could retreat when raiders came, places with walls and gates and a garrison to keep them. This was the beginning of something. The idea that a town could be a defended place, that the king had some responsibility to the people inside it. You might never have visited a burh, but word of them travelled. Safety behind walls was a new concept, and it lingered. The making of those walls was itself a form of labour, levied on the people of the surrounding countryside. Not unlike the weak work that would define the later manorial system, but in this case directed toward building something that was meant to protect everyone. Every hide of land owed so many feet of wall. Men came with their tools and their oxen and their timber, and they built. Your back would have known that labour, the kind of work that does not ask permission, that simply lands on whoever is standing closest. The finished burr was not elegant. A bank of earth, a timber palisade on top of it, a ditch in front of that. But it stood, and it was defensible, and in the years of raiding it represented something new, the organised response of a kingdom to a threat that had seemed, for too long, impossible to organise against. Let that image rest somewhere in your chest. When the fear became too large, people built walls, and the walls held. Scholars have long debated how much the Danelaw actually changed ordinary life for the people who lived in it. Whether Danish custom reshaped the way disputes were settled, the way land was measured, the way families held property, or whether the changes sat mostly at the top of society and left the daily ploughing and sleeping of ordinary people more or less intact. The honest answer is probably somewhere in between, and it varied enormously from one village to the next. What is harder to debate is the language, and here it touches you directly because you carry it still. Half the words we use for the most ordinary things, window, sky, knife, skin, they, them, their, came in with the Northmen, so thoroughly absorbed that no one now thinks of them as foreign. Say one of those words quietly in your mind, window, sky, and notice that it costs nothing. It belongs to you now, and someone carried it here across the sea. By the time the Danish settlements had fully settled, there were murmurs of something new. Not from the north this time, and not from across the sea to the east. The whispers came from the south, from across the narrow water of the channel. There was a duke there, in a place called Normandy. His people were, in a strange loop of history, descendants of earlier Northmen who had themselves settled and been absorbed and learned a new language and become something else entirely. Think for a moment about what it meant to live inside this gradual mixing, not as a historical process, but as a texture of days. Your loom stands against the east wall of the cottage, a simple upright frame with weighted threads of undyed wool hanging from the beam. The cloth you weave is coarse and thick, grey-brown, the colour of the raw fleece before it was washed and combed and spun by your own hands over the winter evenings. It will not look like the finer cloth that comes into the market from the Flemish towns. You have seen a piece of that once, held it between your fingers, felt how the threads were packed so close they were almost smooth. Your cloth is not that. But it is waterproof in the rain and warm against the body, and it will last several years with careful mending, and that is what matters. The wool itself came from sheep that grazed the common field from March to November. In spring you help with the shearing, not because you own all the sheep, but because the shearing is communal, the same way the ploughing is communal, everyone working along the flock and the air full of the lanolin smell of fleece and the bleat of animals being turned over and held. The raw fleece is heavy and greasy in your arms. You carry it home and wash it in the creek, the water going grey and opaque around it, and spread it on the hedge to dry in whatever sun there is. Then the carding, combing the fibres straight with a pair of wooden paddles set with iron teeth, pulling them smooth until the wool comes off in a long, soft roll. Then the spinning, the drop spindle falling and turning, the thread drawing out thin and even, or thin and uneven if you are tired, which you usually are. All of this before the weaving even begins. Now picture yourself in early October, the last of the harvest stacked and the weather turning. The morning's smell of wet leaves and turned earth, a heaviness in the air that means the cold is coming back. You go out to the garden strip, that narrow patch behind the cottage where you grow leeks and onions and a few root vegetables that can be pulled before the ground freezes, and you pull the remaining leeks, shaking the soil off the roots, carrying them inside in bunches. The onions have already been braided and hung from the rafter, where they will last until late winter if the cottage stays dry enough. The leeks will go into the pot. Everything goes into the pot eventually. You stand in the doorway for a moment with the leeks in your arms, looking out at the common where the cattle are still grazing on what is left of the autumn growth, their breath beginning to show white in the cool air. The light is low and amber and everything it touches. The thatched roofs, the mud of the lane, the flank of the nearest cow, takes on a warmth that the actual temperature does not have. It will be dark in 2 hours. There is still firewood to split. You do not know this yet, standing in your field with the autumn mist thinning around you. The bread will be ready soon. The oxen need watering. The year turns on. The battle itself lasted a day. In the morning there was a shield wall, English, on a ridge above a marshy valley. By evening it had broken, and the English king was dead. The year was 1066. That is all you need to know about the battle. What matters, what you are going to feel, if you are a farmer or a miller or a blacksmith or a tanner living anywhere in England in the years that follow, is not the battle. It is what comes after. And what comes after is stranger and more unsettling and more permanent than any single day of fighting could ever be. Picture yourself in a village, not far from a river. It is perhaps a year after the battle, or 2 years, or 3. Your life has continued in its familiar shape. The fields, the animals, the seasons, the parish priest who knows your name and your sins in roughly equal measure. But one morning men arrive. Not soldiers, exactly, though there are soldiers with them. Men with measuring rods and wax tablets, and a way of looking at everything as if they are calculating its value. They want to know how many ploughs you have. How many oxen? How many pigs and where the pigs graze in autumn? How many people live in your household? Whether the mill is yours or the Lord's. Whether the wood is yours or the Lord's. You answer because there is no other reasonable thing to do. This survey happened. It was ordered by the new king. William, the Duke from Normandy, in 1086, 20 years after the battle. His men rode into every shire, sat in every county court, and asked every question that could be asked. The record they compiled was so thorough and so final that people called it the Domesday Book, as if its verdicts were as irrevocable as the Last Judgment. No appeal. No second opinion. Everything written down. Who held what land, what it was worth, who had held it before the battle and who held it now. The gap between those two columns, before and after, tells a quiet story. Let that quiet reach you where you are lying now. The before column, the after column, and the whole world that disappeared between them. The names in the after column are mostly French. Robert, William, Geoffrey, Hugh. The names in the before column are mostly English. Aelfric, Leofwine, Godwine, Wulfnoth. In the space of a generation, virtually the entire upper landowning class of England had been replaced. Not gradually, not peacefully, but thoroughly. A man whose father had held a dozen hides of good farmland might now hold nothing, or might hold the same land as a subtenant under a new lord whose grandfather he had never heard of. Now you are that man. Or that woman, standing in the field you have worked since childhood, watching a timber structure go up on a mound of raw earth at the edge of the village. The mound itself was dug by the people of the village at the new lord's orders. You helped dig it. The structure on top is a wooden tower, and around it there will be a palisade, and below the mound there will be a yard with a hall and a stable and a chapel. It is called a motte and bailey. It is not beautiful. It is not intended to be beautiful. It is intended to be visible and tall, and to remind you every morning when you come out of your door that there is a man in this village who can force you to dig earthworks. You will never go inside it. The tower is not for you. Think about what the digging felt like, because this is history at the level of the body, not the chronicle. You were handed a wooden spade with an iron-shod blade and told where to dig. The soil in that part of the field was clay-heavy, and in October it was cold and dense, each spadeful a full effort of the arms and back. By midday your hands had blistered, and the blisters had broken, and the handle was slick. There was no midday meal, or what was given was not enough. The men with swords stood at the perimeter and did not help and did not leave. By the time the mound reached its required height, you had been digging for the better part of a week, and the field you should have been preparing for winter wheat had not been touched. Now picture yourself that winter, in the cottage, with the fire lower than it should be because the wood gathering had fallen behind while you dug the Lord's mound. The draught comes through the gap under the door and moves across the floor, and you feel it on your ankles even sitting close to the hearth. The children sleep in their cloaks. The bread is thinner than last year's because the wheat sowing was late and the yield reflected it. You lie in the dark and listen to the animals breathing on the other side of the low partition, and you think about the tower on the mound, and then you stop thinking about the tower on the mound, because thinking about it does not help anything. lord speaks French. Not a French you recognize from anywhere. You have never heard French before, not in any form. He might have a steward or a reeve who speaks some English, enough to relay instructions, to tell you when the labour service is due, to explain what the Lord expects at harvest. But the Lord himself, in the hall you will never enter, speaks to his household in a language that is entirely opaque to you. When he gives a command, it passes through an interpreter before it reaches you. This is the texture of conquest at the village level. Not violence, most days, but a permanent opacity, a sense that the people who hold power over your life are operating in a register you cannot access. The language split went deep and stayed strange for centuries. It lives in English still. The animal in the field, which you tend and feed and lead to water, keeps its English name: cow, sheep, pig, deer. The same animal, once it has been slaughtered and cooked and carried to the Lord's table, acquires a French name: beef, mutton, pork, venison. The people doing the tending spoke English. The people doing the eating spoke French. No arrangement of words could describe the social hierarchy more exactly. This opacity showed up in small ways, every day, in the texture of ordinary transactions. When the reeve came to your door to collect the payment that was owed at Michaelmas, the tallage, the heriot, whatever this particular lord had decided to levy, he recited the amount in numbers that still sometimes came out in French syllables, and you counted out the coins in English, and neither of you was quite sure the other had understood, and there was a long pause while someone checked the tally stick. A tally stick is a notched hazel rod, split lengthways, one half for the Lord's steward and one half for you, the notches recording the debt or the payment. When the two halves were held together, they matched, and the account was closed, and the steward put his half back in his satchel and walked to the next door. This was how trust worked when the two parties did not share a language, not in words but in wood, in the physicality of a split stick that could not be forged without both halves agreeing. There was a moment in the winter of 1069 and 1070, harder to see from the village, something you might only have known as a darkening of news from the north, a few refugees passing through, a whispered report that the king's men had burned the harvest. The harrying of the north, it is called now, a campaign of deliberate destruction across Yorkshire and beyond, aimed at crushing resistance by removing the means of survival. Farms burned. Livestock slaughtered. Grain destroyed. Historians differ on the scale, but accounts from the time speak of a landscape emptied of people, of travellers finding only bones along the roads years later. You, in your village to the south, might have heard almost nothing of this. Or you might have heard enough to lie quietly for a long time, listening to the darkness and thinking it best not to make trouble. The refugees who did pass through your village carried almost nothing, a bundle on the back, a child by the hand. They did not stay long, because there was nothing to offer them, and they moved on westward, thin and quiet. You gave one of them a heel of bread and watched them go, and you did not ask what they had seen, because you could tell from the way they walked that asking would not help either of you. Scholars have argued at length about how complete the Norman replacement of English landholders really was. whether small landowners survived in greater numbers than the Domesday record suggests, whether some continuity of English tenure persisted beneath the surface, especially in areas away from the main Norman landholdings. The Domesday survey records what was visible and taxable. What went unrecorded may have been more varied. What is less disputed is that at the level of the great estates, the earldoms, the major manors, the turnover was as close to total as a medieval conquest could manage. The castle on its mound weathers the first winter. A chapel goes up inside the bailey. The Lord's French-speaking steward begins to learn a few English words, enough to say bring and carry and more. And you, slowly, without deciding to, begin to learn a word or two of French. Not the French of the hall. Enough to understand what is being asked. Language finds its way in through necessity, the way water finds the lowest crack. Somewhere to the east, in the flat country beyond the wood, there is another manor, and another after that. All of them with their mound and their tower and their new lord. All of them with their old fields, their old strips, their old rhythm of ploughing and planting and praying for rain. There is one more thing to feel your way into, because it matters to understanding how ordinary life absorbs upheaval. The work of the fields did not stop during the years of conquest. It could not stop. Wheat does not pause because the kingdom has changed hands. The ox does not rest because there is a new name above the manor. Notice that steadiness somewhere in your own body now, the continuation that has nothing to do with kings or battles, the quiet persistence of the work. In the weeks after the battle, in the autumn of 1066, people in villages across England were doing exactly what they would have done in any other autumn, cutting and stacking, leading animals to the pond, gathering the last of the bean harvest before frost, mending the gap in the ditch that had been leaking water onto the lower strip since August. Life continued at the pace that life had always continued, which is the pace of the animal that needs feeding, and the crop that needs cutting, and the fire that needs a new log before it goes out. Now picture yourself a morning in that first winter after the conquest, going out to tend the ox before dawn. The animal is in the lean-to shed against the back wall of the cottage, and you can hear it shifting before you open the door. The air outside is sharp and clear, and the stars are still up, very bright and very cold. Your breath makes a small cloud. Your feet find the familiar path to the shed without needing light, because you have walked it 10,000 times. Inside, the ox's warmth is immediate and welcome. The heat of a large body, the sweet sourness of dung and straw and animal breath. You fill the manger from the hay you cut and dried in June, feeling the dry crackle of the grass between your fingers, smelling the dusty sweetness of it. The ox pulls at the hay and you stand beside it for a moment, one hand on its neck, feeling the slow roll of chewing through your palm. Outside, somewhere in the village, a dog barks twice and goes quiet. On the mound at the end of the lane, the tower is a dark shape against the lightening sky. You do not look at it long. You go back inside, and you put a log on the coals, and you wait for the water to heat. The fields are still there. Whatever else has changed, the fields are still there. And the village has its other continuities, smaller and harder to name. The pattern of the lane through the houses, worn down to a hollow track by the passage of feet and hooves over 200 or 300 years before the Normans ever arrived. The well at the centre of the settlement, stone-lined, the rope worn smooth where it has been gripped 10,000 times. The apple tree in the yard of the house, 2 doors along, old enough that no one remembers planting it, its trunk bent and black and still producing fruit. These things were here before the battle. Let your body settle into that thought, as if the ground beneath you has its own long memory. They will be here long after the tower on the mound has rotted back into the earth. The conquest is a layer in the ground. Beneath it, the older layers press upward. The day begins before light. Not because anyone has decided it should. There is no decision involved. The ox needs feeding before it can work, and the ox must work before the frost comes back hard, and the ploughing cannot wait, and so you are awake in the dark. The cottage is one room. Everything is in it, the sleeping, the eating, the fire that you bank carefully at night so there will be something to coax back in the morning. Along one wall, the space where the animals sleep, not for sentiment, but for warmth, because in January the body heat of 2 cows and a handful of sheep adds a degree or 2 to the air, and that degree matters. The smell you have lived with all your life and stopped noticing long ago. A person coming in from outside would notice. You do not. The fire is your whole kitchen. There is a pot on the trivet, iron, heavy, handed down and repaired and handed down again. And in it there is pottage, which has been in it in various forms for most of your life. Pottage is not a recipe, it is a condition. It is whatever you have, oats, dried peas, a scrape of lard, a handful of leek, whatever the garden gave last autumn and you managed to dry before the rot took it. In summer there are fresh herbs in it, pot herbs, grown in the strip of ground behind the cottage, close enough to water on wet years. In winter there is less, and you stretch it with more water, and you eat it twice a day and do not think about what you are not eating. The bread, when there is bread, is flat and dense, rye or maslin, a mix of rye and wheat, baked in the ashes or on a flat stone, gritty with the millstone's grinding. You have broken a tooth on bread before. Everyone has. You are a villain. The word will not mean what later centuries make of it. Not yet a slur, simply a designation. A person of the ville, the village, a person attached to the land of a manor. What this means in practice is that you cannot leave. Not permanently. Not without permission. The land holds you as surely as the soil holds the root of the winter wheat. Not with chains, but with obligation, with the fact that your strips are here, your family is here, your entire world is here, and the Lord's court would have you back before you reach the next county. The manor itself is the unit of everything. At its centre is the Lord's demesne, his own land, farmed for his own account. Around it, the open fields, great unhedged expanses divided into long narrow strips, and your strips are scattered through those fields in a pattern that looks random but is not. The scattering is intentional, or was intentional once, so that good ground and bad ground is distributed, so that no one family ends up with all the wet low strips or all the dry high ones. Your strips might number a dozen, scattered across 3 different fields, none of them touching the others. You know exactly where each one is. You have known since you were a child following your father along the balks, the unploughed ridges of grass that mark the boundaries between strips. 3 fields. In the first field this year, winter wheat or rye, sown in the autumn and now thickening under the cold. In the second, the spring crop, oats or barley or peas and beans to put something back into the soil. In the third, nothing. The third field lies fallow, resting, grazed by sheep whose droppings are the only fertilizer you have. Next year the wheel turns. The fallow field becomes the spring field field becomes the winter field rests. A 3-year cycle, turning as reliably as the seasons, as old as anyone alive can remember. 2 days a week, more in some manors, fewer in others. You owe work on the mezzanine. This is called week work, and it is not negotiable. You bring your ox, your plough, your back, your time, and you work the Lord's land. At harvest, there are additional days called boon work, the great shared labour of cutting and carting and stacking when the whole manor turns out and the fields must be cleared before the rain comes. On those days you might get a meal. Bread and ale at midday, sometimes a piece of cheese, sometimes a pottage. It is not charity. It is part of the arrangement, woven into the custom of the manor for longer than anyone can remember. But it is still food, and you eat it. The reeve is a villager, usually one of the more prosperous ones, elected or appointed to manage the communal work. He knows who owes what day, who is already served, who is trying to slip away. He is not your enemy. He is often your neighbour, but he is the Lord's instrument in a way that you are not, and there is a wariness between you. The hayward watches the fields and the fences, making sure animals do not break through into the standing crops. The bailiff serves the Lord more directly, keeping accounts, reporting to the manor court. These are the layers of small authority that govern your days, all of them below the Lord and above the ordinary villager, all of them necessary, all of them capable of making your life easier or harder depending on the year and the mood. The Lord's mill stands by the stream. You are required to grind your grain there and nowhere else, and to pay for the grinding and a portion of the flour. You might have a hand quern at home, a small stone for grinding small amounts, but using it openly or using a neighbour's mill outside the Lord's system is the kind of thing the manor court notices. The mill is one of those arrangements you did not choose and cannot opt out of, one of many invisible strings that tie the daily life of the manor to the Lord's account. The same is true of the oven in some manors. Bake in your own cottage or pay to use the Lord's. The same, in some places, for the wine press. Wherever a process concentrates what dispersed people need, there is usually a Lord's monopoly waiting. Now picture yourself on a Wednesday in late October, walking to the mill with a sack of barley across your back. The path follows the stream bank, and the stream is running high after 2 days of rain, brown with silt, pulling at the exposed roots of the willows. The mill wheel turns with a sound you have heard so many times that you hear it in your sleep. A deep, slow, wooden knock and rush, the water falling off the paddles in a curtain. You hand your sack to the miller, and he opens it and looks at the grain and says nothing, because this is what millers do. They look at the grain and they say nothing, and later they take their portion, and you both know they take a little more than the custom allows, and you say nothing, because the miller is useful and you will need him again in 6 weeks. You wait by the door, feeling the cold coming off the stream. The flour, when it comes back to you in the sack, is slightly warm from the grinding. You press your hand into it on the walk home, feeling the fine dust settle into the cracks of your skin, and you think about bread. You do not only use the Lord's land. There is the common, rough pasture, wetland, woodland edge, where the villagers of the manor graze animals they could not otherwise feed. Your cow has a right to the common. Your pigs have a right to the wood in autumn when the acorns fall. This is called pannage, and there is a small payment for it, but the right itself is real. The wood gives more than acorns: timber for fences, fallen branches for fuel, leaves for bedding, the occasional deer that no one mentions officially. The common and the wood are not wild spaces, exactly. They are managed, overseen, their use governed by the same manor court that governs everything else. But they are something close to open, and in a life structured by obligation and toll and service, they matter. The manor court meets perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, in the hall or under a tree if the weather holds. Disputes between villagers come here: the neighbour whose animals broke your fence, the man who ploughed over the balk into your strip, the woman whose goat ate the young wheat. Small thefts, small trespasses, the endless friction of people living too close together with too much depending on each small piece of ground. The court also enforces the Lord's customs, records who owes what service, extracts the fees that are owed at every threshold of life, registers the death of a villein and the heriot payment that must be made before his son can inherit. Nothing is free at the manor court. Even justice costs something. Feel the weight of that from where you are now, lying still. How different this place is, how much has been given to you simply by the hour you were born in. The year has its own texture, separate from all of this administration. In February, the heavy plough comes out. The big wheeled plough with its iron coulter to cut the sod and its mouldboard to turn it, pulled by a team of 6 or 8 oxen that no single family owns outright. The oxen are pooled, the plough is shared, the labour is communal in a way that the strip system alone is not. You guide the team, or you drive it, or you walk behind pressing the plough into the earth. Each role has its person, and the team moves in a long line down the strip, turning at the headland, coming back. The furrows are slightly curved, a banana bow shape, because the team is hard to turn, and you begin the curve early. These curves survive in some English fields still, fossilized in the slight undulation of the ground, the ridge and furrow that grass has grown over for 7 centuries. Haymaking comes in June, a frantic few weeks when the grass must be cut and dried and stored before rain returns. Harvest in August and September, the hardest work of the year, when every available hand is in the field from first light until it is too dark to see. Then the Martinmas slaughter in November, around the feast of St. Martin on the 11th, when the animals that cannot be fed through winter are killed and the meat salted and hung. The salt box matters more than anything at this time of year. Salt is expensive, bought at the market, and the amount you can afford determines how much meat survives until spring. The days shorten. The fire is fed. The barrels of salt pork sit in the corner of the cottage, and you try not to think about how long they need to last. Historians have argued about how harsh villenage really was, whether the legal subjection of the villein to the lord was experienced as grinding misery, or as a relatively stable, if constrained, arrangement that offered security in exchange for service. The answer was almost certainly different in different manners, in different decades, under different lords. A lord who managed his demesne well kept the mill in repair, didn't press for extra boon work in bad years, and ran a fair manor court could preside over a village where life was hard but not intolerable. A lord who was rapacious, or simply absent and represented by a grasping bailiff, could make the same system a source of constant misery. The custom of the manor was a protection, in theory. You owed what custom said you owed, and no more. But custom could be argued, and the man doing the arguing in the manor court usually had the hall. Still, the strips are yours to tend. The fallow sheep graze. The bread is in the pot. Outside, in the early dark, the common stretches away toward the wood, and somewhere in the wood a branch settles under its own weight. The day will end when the fire is banked again, when the animals have been checked, when the children are down, and the cold is pressing at the thatch. Before you sleep, you lie still and feel the warmth of the bed straw beneath you, the rough weave of the blanket across your chest, the faint give of the mattress stuffed with last summer's dried sedge. The fire has dropped to coals, and the room has grown darker, and the animals on the other side of the wall have gone quiet. Tomorrow the ox will need feeding before the plough can move, and the balk on the west strip needs remarking before the neighbour's team drifts over it again. But that is tomorrow. For now, the coals breathe low and orange, and the cottage holds its warmth, and the dark outside the thatch is very still. You do not need a clock. You know what hour it is the moment the bell speaks. It comes from the tower at the far end of the field, a low stone building, older than anyone alive can remember, its walls thick as a man's forearm is long, its single bell casting a sound that rolls across the ploughland and the common pasture and the marshy ground by the brook. You have lived your whole life inside that sound. So did your father. So did his. The bell is not a notification, not a reminder, not a nuisance. The bell is the structure of the day itself, and without it the hours would have no shape at all. Only a grey and undifferentiated light from sunrise to dark. The monks in the great abbeys have a name for each hour. Matins comes in the deep middle of the night, when the sky is still hard black and the air in the cloister is cold enough to see your breath rise. Then Lords, just before the first grey. prime at dawn. Terce, sext, none, each marking a station in the long turn of the day. Vespers as the light goes amber. Compline at the last of dusk, and then the great silence settles over the monastery until the darkness calls them up again. They call it the Opus Dei, the work of God, and they mean it exactly. Everything else, the copying and the brewing and the farming, is secondary. The hours of prayer are the thing itself, the real labour, and each hour is announced by the ringing of the bell, so that every monk, wherever he stands in the cloister or the garden, knows precisely where he is inside the day. You are not a monk. But the sound of that daily marking reaches you anyway. In your village, the rhythm is simpler, cruder. You hear the tower strike at dawn and you know the day has started. You hear the midday hour and you pause to eat the bread you carried from the house this morning, sitting on the turned earth at the furlong's end, the ox chewing beside you. You hear it in the late afternoon and you know the light has turned and you should start thinking about the walk home. And on Sundays, and on the great saints' days that stud the year like knots in a plank, you set down your tools entirely, because those are the days the Church claims in full. The parish is everything. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the word has lost its weight. The parish is not merely the place you go on Sundays. It is the record of your life. Every birth written down, every marriage spoken in the church porch, every body laid in the ground beneath the yew tree by the south wall. It is your legal identity, in a way. To belong to a parish is to exist. The priest knows your name. He knows which children are yours, which cow died in the autumn, which field strip you farm, and which you are disputing with your neighbour. He is. The list is unavoidable. Your clerk, your calendar, your confessor, and your occasional weather prophet. He is also probably not a learned man. He can say the Mass, and he can read enough Latin to follow the office, though how much of it he understands is another matter entirely. He farms a glebe strip like the rest of you, perhaps 2 or 3 acres in the common field, and his hands are not soft. He comes from a village himself, not your village, likely, because the Church prefers a little distance, but somewhere just like it. There are grand cathedrals and learned bishops and scholars who write Latin treatises in warm scriptoriums, and all of that is real, but it is not the world of the village priest. His world is yours. Step inside the church for a moment, because the building itself tells you something the priest's words cannot. You push the south door open and feel the change in air at once. Cooler, stiller, carrying the particular damp that stone breathes after long standing. The floor is rammed earth and flat stones worn smooth by feet, and where the light comes in through the narrow east window, it falls in a pale column that touches the altar cloth and makes the white linen look almost luminous. The nave is plain, rough plaster walls, wooden benches for the aged, the rest of the congregation standing. But it is not empty of colour. In addition to the dome above the chancel arch, there are smaller paintings. A St. Christopher carrying the child across the water, the blues faded but legible, a crowned female figure who might be St. Catherine, a tree of vices and virtues whose branches are labelled in Latin, whose shape you know. The incense from the morning mass still hangs in the air, a dry sweetness settled into the stone over decades, so that even on ordinary weekdays the building carries it. On the wall of the church, the broad whitewashed interior wall above the chancel arch, there is a painting. You know it so well you sometimes stop seeing it, but let yourself look again now, in this moment of quiet. The plaster is cool to the touch when you rest your palm against it. The pigments are earthy, ochre, red lead, white lime, and a dark manganese black, laid down by a painter who came through the village perhaps 30 years ago and worked for a fortnight on ladders while the village watched from the nave. The lime still smells faintly of itself on a damp day, a chalky mineral smell that you associate with the building itself, with the feeling of being inside stone walls and slightly apart from the noise outside. The painting shows the Last Judgment. Christ sits in glory at the centre, robed in gold if the painter had gold leaf, and in bright ochre if he did not. To his right, the blessed rise toward heaven in a calm procession, their faces peaceful, their garments clean. To his left, your left as you stand in the nave, the damned descend into the mouth of hell, which the painter has rendered as a great gaping beast, a furnace of dark reds and muddy blacks, full of figures twisted in horror. The painting is not meant to be beautiful. It is meant to be seen and remembered in every ordinary moment of ordinary life. Every time you enter this building, the wall tells you how the account stands. The parish priest calls this the doom. The tithe is simpler to explain. 1/10 of what the land produces goes to the church. Grain, livestock, hay. The calculation is made at harvest time, in the open, before witnesses, because disputes over the tithe are as old as the tithe itself. You do not resent it exactly. It is simply a fact, like the rain. It pays for the priest's bread. It pays, in the great houses, for candles and vestments and the upkeep of the building. Somewhere in the gap between the small village church and the vast cathedral city, some of it is lost to purposes that are less easy to account for. But that thought is not something you spend much time on. Now imagine that your child is sick. Not a winter cold. Not the fever that comes and goes in 3 days. Something deeper, a wasting that has lasted weeks, a cough the village herbalist has not been able to touch, a pain in the chest that wakes the child at night. You have prayed at the church. You have lit a candle at the small side altar near the font, where a carved figure of the church's patron saint stands in a painted niche, one hand raised, the colours on the stone rubbed faint where hands have touched the feet over generations. The priest has said the words. And you have decided, because there is nothing else to decide, to walk to Canterbury. The journey is perhaps 50 miles from the Kentish villages, longer from the north and west. You go on foot because you have no horse, and because walking is itself part of the purpose. The road is not empty. It is full of people doing exactly what you are doing, and this is one of the things that strikes you the first time you set out on a pilgrimage. There are whole families. There are old men and old women who should probably not be making this journey at all. There are young men who seem almost at ease about it, talking as they walk, their scrips slung over one shoulder. You walk with them and it feels, strangely, like a loosening, a release from the daily grid of the field and the village and the same faces in the same places, a proof that the world extends further than the boundary of your own parish. The road itself becomes a kind of intimacy. You walk in your worn leather shoes until the soles soften and the road comes through, and you feel the difference in the ground, packed gravel, then rutted clay, then the chalky white dust of the downland where the path rises and you can see for miles. You sleep in pilgrim hostels, crowded and smelling of damp wool and tallow, your pack tucked under your head. You share food with strangers and learn, over 3 days of walking, more about another person's life than you would learn in a year of nodding past them at the village well. The road levels something. There are small shrines along the way, at the roadside, in the angle of a bridge, at the foot of a waymarked cross. They are modest things, a carved niche in a stone wall, a wooden figure in a little roofed shelter, a smooth-worn hollow where pilgrims have rested their hands. Someone always keeps them, fresh flowers in summer, a stub of tallow candle in autumn, a scrap of cloth tied to the cross beam by a person whose prayer you can only guess at. The road is continuous with the parish, an extension of the same fabric of devotion stretched thin across the landscape. The shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury draws thousands every year. The Archbishop was murdered at his altar in 1170. 4 nights, a dark December evening, a dispute between the king and the church that you do not fully understand and do not need to. And within years the miracles began and the pilgrims came and the shrine became one of the holiest in all of England. What you know, walking toward it, is simpler. You know that holy men sometimes intercede, that the saints are not far away, that God hears the prayers made at certain places with a particular attention. You stop at the shrine, you kneel, you say what you came to say. You buy a badge, a small lead ampulla, a pilgrim token, to prove you came and to carry a little of the holiness home with you. Some people never come home at all. Some choose not to. There is a woman in the village. There is always such a woman in every village, who many years ago gave herself to an anchoritic life. She had herself walled into a small cell beside the church, a single opening to receive food and to offer counsel, another tiny opening onto the church interior so she could follow the Mass. She speaks to those who come to her window with their sorrows, and her voice is quiet and her manner is not alarming, and somehow the fact that she chose to stop moving entirely, chose to make herself fixed while the whole restless world turns outside her wall, gives her words a weight that ordinary words do not have. She prays. That is all she does, and it is enough, and the village is obscurely glad she is there. When you finally kneel at the Canterbury Shrine, you are in a building that dwarfs everything you have ever stood inside. The cathedral is stone on a scale that the village church, for all its solidity, only distantly gestures toward. The columns rise into darkness above the candles. The floor is paved in great slabs, cold even through leather soles, worn in paths where feet have moved for a century. The smell is beeswax and incense and the faint mineral breath of old stone, and underneath it all, very faintly, something metallic, the silver of the shrine casing, the gilding, the votives hung from the structure by wire and thread. You kneel and the stone receives your knees, and you say the words you came to say, and whether or not the prayer reaches its destination you cannot know. But you are here. You came. The walking was real, and the road was real, and the weight you set down at the shrine. Grief or fear or the exhausted love of a parent watching a child suffer was real too, and the setting down of it feels like something. How deeply ordinary people understood the doctrine behind all of this is genuinely disputed among historians. The theology of grace and purgatory and the intercession of the saints was complex and not always consistently taught. What survives in the records suggests that most people worked with the practical texture of faith. The tower's marking of the hours, the painting, the pilgrimage, the priest, rather than with its theoretical architecture. And that may be closer to the truth of religious life in any era than the arguments of the schoolmen suggest. Somewhere ahead, there is a noise you have not heard before. Not the road. Something more intermittent, more human. The cry of a market, the smell of fresh-baked bread and worse things together, the sound of a town waking up. Smell it before you see it. The town announces itself from half a mile away on a still morning, a dense, layered smell that has no single name. There is wood smoke, yes, and the yeasty breath of the bakehouse, and something floral and sweet from the apothecary's stall, and underneath all of that, running like a bass note through everything else, the smell of a great many people and animals in close proximity on streets that were not designed with drainage as their primary concern. The open channel down the centre of the main street carries what it carries, and in August it carries it slowly. You learn to step around it without thinking. Everybody does. Now you are in it, the press and noise of market day, and you feel it in your chest before you understand it. The market town, and by the 12th and 13th centuries there are hundreds of them in every corner of England, comes to life once a week on market day, and on that day the streets fill to a press that would have astonished you the first time you came in from the open fields. Shoulders knock against yours. A woman with a basket of live chickens pushes past, the birds clucking and lurching in their slatted cage. A cart horse stands unmoved in the middle of the lane while the crowd parts around it like water around a stone. The smell of it changes as you move, sweet at the bakehouse door, sharp and acrid as you pass the tannery lane, sweetly rotten near the fish stall, then warm and bready again as you turn the corner and find the grain merchant's open sacks. Farmers with their surplus grain. Women with chickens in slatted baskets. A tanner working at the town's far margin, always downwind if the wind cooperates, always placed where the worst of the smell can thin before it reaches the stalls, whose pit of oak bark and urine has been soaking hides for 3 weeks and produces a smell that clears a radius around his stall, even in the crowded market. Fish, if the town is near water or near a decent road. Fresh if you are lucky, salted if you are not, and even the salted fish has a smell that announces itself. Bread. hot bread from the bakehouse down the lane, the kind of smell that you follow involuntarily without deciding to. The bakehouse itself is a low building, its door open onto the lane, its interior a wall of heat and amber light. You can see the baker through the doorway, a broad man with flour on his forearms to the elbow, sliding a long-handled peel under a row of dark loaves, the bread hissing faintly as it meets the cooler air near the door. He has been at work since before first light. The law says his loaves must weigh what he says they weigh, and inspectors do come, and the penalty for a short loaf is a public humiliation that no one forgets quickly. He knows this. He also knows that in a crowded market, nobody stays to weigh every loaf, and that confidence sells as much as accuracy. The buildings lean toward each other. The upper stories are jettied, pushed out over the street on heavy timber brackets so that the first floor overhangs the ground floor and the second overhangs the first, and from the street you look up to find the eaves of houses on opposite sides nearly touching. The effect is that the sky above the street is a narrow ribbon of grey or blue, and the street itself is always in partial shadow. This is not an accident. Jettying is practical. It gives you more floor area upstairs without taking more ground, and ground in a town is expensive. But it also means that the street feels intimate, compressed, as if the town is leaning in to hear what you are saying. The stalls are wooden, temporary, hinged boards that fold down from the shop front to become the counter. The baker's goods are at eye level. The cloth merchant's bolts are draped over the front of the frame. The spice merchant, a rare figure and a wealthy one, has small sacks of pepper and ginger and cumin arranged in careful rows behind him, and he watches the crowd with the alert, unhurried attention of someone who has something everybody wants and knows it. You pause in front of those sacks and breathe in. A dry, warm, faintly foreign smell. Nothing like the village fields, nothing like the road, something that has come a very long way to be here. The pepper alone has crossed the Mediterranean and the Channel and several sets of middlemen's hands. You look at the price and move on. Look down the side lane where the dyers work. The cloth hangs in long damp strips from poles strung between the buildings. Scarlet, a deep blue-black, a muddy yellow that will brighten as it dries. The dye vats are set into the ground below street level, and the smell coming up from them is extraordinary. Fermented woad has an ammonia sharpness that goes straight to the back of your throat, and the mordant vats carry a sour mineral sourness underneath it. The dyer himself moves between the poles with a long wooden paddle, turning the cloth with the slow, unhurried attention of someone whose work cannot be hurried. The colours will run if the water is too hot, will not set if the water is too cool, will fade by summer if the mordant is wrong. He has learned this by ruining cloth, and the ruined cloth was deducted from his wages, and he did not repeat those particular mistakes. Your own hands are still in your lap, loose and unhurried. Let them stay that way. Now step back to the main thoroughfare and feel the weight of the afternoon in it. The morning rush has thinned. Stall holders who sold out early are folding their boards and loading their carts. A boy is sweeping the channel with a bundle of rushes, moving the day's detritus along. A dog works the ground under an abandoned fish stall with methodical hope. Two women sit on a step outside a cookshop sharing something from a shared cloth, bread, and something hot that steams, and one of them is laughing at something the other said, her head tipped back, and the sound of it is entirely ordinary and entirely alive, and it is the sound this town always makes when the formal business of the day relaxes its grip. Let that sound settle over you the way the afternoon is settling over them. This town is not just a market. It is something else too, something that was made possible only recently and that still feels strange and new to many people. It is a chartered borough. The lord of the land, or in some cases the king himself, has granted the town a charter, and the charter means that the people who live here live under rules that are different from the rules that govern the countryside. They pay their obligations in money, not in labour. They are not tied to the land they were born on. And this, slowly, came to generate one of the most extraordinary facts of medieval life. Town air makes free. The saying is not a slogan. It is a legal principle. If you are a serf, bound to your lord's manor, unable to leave without permission, owing your labour and your produce and your obedience, and you slip away and make your way to a borough, and you live there for a year and a day without being reclaimed, you become free. Not by any document with a seal on it, but by custom and by the town's willingness to stand behind the fact. Your lord, if he comes looking, has a narrow window. After a year, the town stands with you. This is not a small thing. You find work. Perhaps you come with a skill. You were a carpenter in the village and you knew how to set a joint, and you find a guild that will receive you, or at least allow you to work in the trade until you have proven yourself. The guilds are new too, in their organised form, associations of craftsmen or merchants who have set rules about quality and price and training, who keep an apprentice for 7 years before they call him a journeyman, who keep a journeyman for years more before they call him a master. They hold feasts in their hall on the guild's feast day, and they sometimes care for the widows of their dead members. The idea behind all of this is the just price, the belief, rooted in the Church's teaching about usury and fairness, that a thing should be sold for what it costs to make it, honestly, plus a reasonable livelihood. Now you are inside the workshop of one of these craftsmen, a cordwainer, a maker of new leather shoes, and you can feel what the guild means at ground level. The smell of fresh leather is clean and animal at once, a sharp tang underneath a softer warmth. The floor is packed earth strewn with leather scraps, and the tools hang from wooden pegs along the wall. Curved awls, bone folders, iron-lasting pliers worn smooth in the grip. The master sits at his bench near the window, the light falling across his hands as he pulls a waxed thread through 2 thicknesses of sole, the motion practiced enough to look effortless. The apprentice, perhaps 12 years old, perhaps 14, crouches by the door scraping a dried hide with a draw knife, his arms already developing the particular leanness of someone who does this 6 days a week. Rest your weight back wherever you are lying and let your shoulders settle a little further. The apprentice scrubbing the floor of the workshop at 6 in the morning would perhaps receive the philosophy of the just price with a degree of scepticism. The master sleeps upstairs with his family. The apprentice sleeps in the workshop, on a pallet near the door, and he does not see the master's accounts and does not know what the finished shoes really sell for at market. The just price is an ideal. What the market will bear is a reality, and the space between those two things is where the master's comfort lives. But the system does teach a trade. In 7 years, the apprentice will know everything there is to know about his craft. The quality of hides, the failure modes of stitching in wet weather, the way that last shapes hold or lose their form with use. That knowledge has value, and the guild protects its value by controlling who is allowed to practice. You are warm where you are, and the long, slow work of another person's life is moving gently past you. Once a year, though, the whole careful structure of the town comes briefly apart, and something wilder takes its place. The fair. It might last 3 days or a week. It might be licensed by a saint's day, a charter tied to the feast of some local holy figure, or it might be one of the great fairs that drew traders from across England and from the continent, Starbridge, St. Ives, the great cloth fairs of Boston. For those few days, the town is barely recognizable. Foreign merchants with accents you cannot place sell things you have never seen before. Spices from the Eastern trade, fine cloth from Flanders, wine from Gascony, poured from dark wooden casks. There are entertainers. There are dice games in the alleys. The inns are full and the streets are loud, and the money moves from hand to hand in a way it does not in ordinary time. You watch the crowd from a doorway for a moment and feel the strangeness of it. All these people who do not know each other, who have no common lord, no shared field, no long history of neighbourly obligation, transacting with a directness that village life rarely allows. A Flemish cloth merchant is haggling with a wool trader from the Lincolnshire wolds, neither speaking the other's language with any fluency, both understanding prices perfectly. A woman from the town's tannery quarter is examining a bolt of southern linen with the concentrated attention of someone spending more than she can afford. She runs the cloth between her fingers, holds it against the sky, lets it fall. She buys it. The fair noise is behind you now, receding, and the street is quieter in your mind than it was a moment ago. Historians debate how free town life really was for the poorest people who came to it. The serf who arrived with no skill and no connections might find himself in a different kind of precarity, not bound to land, but also not supported by it, without the common rights of the village that had at least given him fuel and pasture. Freedom and exposure often arrived together. The very bottom of the town, the day labourers sleeping in doorways, the women without recourse, did not much resemble the life of the prosperous guildsman in his jettied house. But the town was growing. And with it, something else was growing, something you can feel in the small irritations of market day. The argument over weights, the accusation that the baker's loaves were short, the stranger who stole from the stall and disappeared into the crowd. Someone needs to settle this. Someone is coming to settle it. You know the law the way you know the weather. It is not something you made or chose. It is simply the condition of the world, and it affects you in ways that are not always visible until the moment they are very visible indeed. The Lord has his court, the manor court that meets in the hall or under the oak tree at the edge of the field, where disputes about unfenced strips and stray animals and unpaid debts are sorted in a familiar, half-improvised way that everyone in the village understands. That court is the law as you have always known it. Then, perhaps once in a generation, something arrives from further away and changes the texture of things. The sheriff comes first, and the sheriff comes often enough that his reputation precedes him into every market town and village in his county. He is the king's officer, appointed to his shire, responsible for collecting revenues and enforcing the royal will, and in the 12th and 13th centuries his office is both powerful and disreputable enough that the word carries a slight edge of wariness in common use. He can be corrupt. He can extort. Notice the weight of the blanket across you, or the steadiness of the floor beneath you. Whatever is solid and yours. He can sit on debts and exact small unofficial fees from people who cannot afford to challenge him. He can also be efficient and fair, and some are, but the option of corruption is always available and not always resisted. Now picture it, the moment his horses come into the village. You hear the hooves on the road before you see anything, a steady, rhythmic knock on the hard-packed surface that has a different quality from the slow plod of a farm cart. Then the horses themselves, well-fed animals out of place on a track accustomed to oxen, and behind them the sheriff's man in a coat that announces authority before he opens his mouth. People pause what they are doing. They do not run. They watch, and the watching itself is a kind of information, noting who is here, who is not, who moves toward the group, and who finds a reason to walk in the other direction. You are watching too, from somewhere quieter, from here, with the sound of your own breathing the only thing close. But there is something larger than the sheriff, something that moves through the kingdom on a long circuit and that causes, when it is coming, a particular stir that is different from ordinary anxiety. The justices in ire. Ire is an old word, from the French, meaning a journey. The royal justices travel from county to county on a great legal circuit, sitting in each town for days or weeks, hearing every case that has accumulated since the last time they came. The last time they came might have been 7 years ago. It might have been longer. The ire is not a regular comfort. It is an event, and it requires preparation. The village has to send its representatives. Every unexplained death, every serious crime, every dispute of substance has been recorded and held, waiting. The day the justices arrive and set up their court in the great hall of the castle or the guild hall is not a day when the town relaxes. You are called to serve on a jury of your neighbours. You walk to the town and find the hall already crowded. Men you recognise from the surrounding villages, standing in the damp air, speaking in low voices, nobody quite sure where to stand or what expression to wear. The hall has a high ceiling and stone walls and a dais at the far end where the justices will sit, and there is a smell to it. Old timbers, rush matting, the particular cold that stone holds even in autumn. You wait. Everyone waits. This is newer than it seems. Within living memory, or just beyond it, the common way to settle a matter of serious guilt was the ordeal. You put the accused man's hand into a cauldron of boiling water and read the wound after 3 days, clean, and he was innocent, infected, and he was not. Or you bound him and threw him into a pond, and the pure water would reject the guilty, and the innocent would sink. These were not methods designed to produce reliable results. They were designed to place the decision in the hands of God, removing the responsibility from the human beings in the room. In 1215, the Church withdrew its blessing from the ordeal, and the ordeal quietly collapsed. Something had to replace it. The jury of neighbours replaced it. 12 men who knew the accused, who knew the circumstances, who knew the ground and the people and the likely truth of the matter. They sat and they deliberated, and they gave a verdict. Not based on the will of God, exactly, but on the collective knowledge of the community. This is both a privilege and a burden. You know these people. You will see them tomorrow in the field. The decision you make today follows you home. The frank pledge was older still and more intimate. Every male in the village over the age of 12 was organized into a tithing, a group of roughly 10 men, though the number varied, and the members of the tithing were responsible for each other. If one man committed a crime and fled, the others owed a fine. If one man failed to appear at court, the others were answerable. This is not a theoretical arrangement. Feel where your body is right now, the particular stillness of it, and let it be exactly that still. It means that every man in the village is, in a quiet and daily way, watching every other man in the village, not with hostility, but with the particular attentiveness of someone who knows that another man's misbehavior will cost him personally. The village polices itself, not because the king sends enough officials to police it directly, but because the king has arranged the village's obligations in a way that makes self-policing cheaper than the alternative. Your breathing is a little slower than it was when this night began. Notice that, if you like. The manor court itself is a smaller, more intimate thing than the air, and it meets far more often, sometimes every few weeks. Picture it in the great hall of the manor house, long tables pushed against the walls, a fire in the central hearth whose smoke drifts toward the louver in the roof, the steward seated at the top table with his roll of parchment and his iron pen case, a candle set close to the writing surface even in daylight because the hall is not bright. The reeve sits nearby. The reeve is one of your own, a villain elected by the village to manage its obligations to the Lord. A position nobody particularly wants, and that is sometimes imposed rather than chosen. He knows everything. He knows which strip has been encroached upon, which widow has let her boundary hedge go, which man's pig got into the Demesne field last Tuesday. He has been keeping this knowledge quietly for weeks, waiting for this day. Now you are sitting on the bench near the wall, waiting for your own case to come. It is a boundary dispute, a matter of 3 furrows in the west field, a strip of earth 6 feet wide and 50 feet long, which your neighbour claims lies within his holding and which you know, because your father farmed it and his father before him, belongs to yours. The matter is read out. Your neighbour speaks. You speak. Two older men are called as witnesses, both of whom were present when the boundaries were last walked and marked 20 years ago, and their memories differ on a single point without either being dishonest. They genuinely remember it differently. The steward listens. He makes a mark on the roll. He consults the previous roll, unrolling it carefully on the table, running a finger down the entries until he finds the one he wants. He gives a judgment. The 3 furrows are yours. Your neighbour is fined 3 pence. The case is closed, and the court moves to the next. You sit back on the bench and breathe out slowly and feel the particular tiredness of having held your attention very tightly for a long time. The afternoon light comes through the hall's high windows at a long angle, catching the dust above the hearth. The smell of the fire and the rushes and the slightly damp wool of all the people waiting is the smell of justice as it actually works, slow and detailed and grounded in the specific texture of a specific piece of land. You came here with a grievance, and you are leaving with a resolution, and the resolution is recorded in ink on a roll of parchment that will be kept in the Lord's chest, and that keeping is itself a kind of permanence, a proof that the thing happened and that it was settled. Now return to your own house for a moment, to the feel of an ordinary autumn evening after a court day. The fire has burned to a bed of embers. The smell is tallow and old straw, and the faint sharpness of the cooling hearth stone. You sit on the bench near the door, which is still slightly ajar, and you can feel the cold coming off the fields. A clean, damp cold, the smell of turned soil and wet leaves, the particular dark that comes to the countryside when there is no moon and no wind, and the world simply sits still. You think about what was said at the hall today, the case that was heard, the verdict that was given. You think about the man who was found guilty and what will happen to him. You think about the man who was found innocent and what his neighbours will think. These thoughts are not exactly anxious. They are simply the texture of a day in which the law came close and touched the ordinary world and then withdrew, leaving a different shape behind it. Whether this feels like freedom or like surveillance depends on which day you ask and which year. In 1215, and you would not have known the year by that number, but the event eventually crept into the edges of your awareness as gossip and rumour, and then as something more settled. A group of powerful barons forced the king to agree to a document. The king was John, and John was unpopular in ways that powerful men found intolerable, arbitrary, financially rapacious, willing to imprison and dispossess his own barons without what they considered adequate process. The document was Magna Carta. You almost certainly did not read it, because you could not read, and even if someone had read it to you, the Latin and the legal precision would have been opaque. The clauses that the barons cared about, the protections against arbitrary imprisonment, the limitations on certain royal financial exactions, were written for men who had property and standing. And yet, something in the document reached further than the barons who wrote it, or at least the idea of something reached further. How much Magna Carta meant to ordinary people in 1215 or in the decades immediately after is genuinely contested among historians. Some argue that its real significance was almost entirely retrospective, built up slowly by later generations who needed a foundational document and chose this one. There may be something in that. Wherever you are right now, the night is settled around you and nothing is being required of you. But the slow, strange thought that the king himself stood under the law, that even he could not simply take and punish and demand without limit. That thought did seep, over time, into the texture of ordinary life. Not as a legal doctrine that villagers could cite, but as a background assumption, that there were rules, that the rules applied to everyone, that the arbitrary was not supposed to be permanent. Something in that thought is still in the air tonight, where you are, settled into the dark like sediment into still water. The village at the end of the 13th century is not a free place, not in any modern sense of the word. The serf still owes his labour. The tithe still comes due at harvest. The sheriff still rides. The justices still arrive, and the tithing still watches. But it is a place with more structure than it had 100 years before. More courts, more record-keeping, more routes of complaint, more ways to make noise when something is wrong. A man wrongly accused has more options than he did. A debt dishonestly claimed can be disputed in a court that is not merely the local lord's. The law is slow and expensive and often unavailable to the very poor, but it is recognizably there, and its presence has changed the feel of things. You are lying in your house deep in a long autumn. The harvest is in. The animals are shut in the byre for warmth. The fire has burned low, and the room smells of old straw and the particular earthen closeness of winter settling in. It is not uncomfortable, exactly. It is the smell of survival arranged, of the year having turned and found you still in it. You do not know what is coming. None of them did, not the priest in his glebe, not the guildmaster in his jettied house, not the serf in his tithing, not the justices on their long circuit. The world as they had made it, slowly and painstakingly and imperfectly over the long centuries since the first Norman horsemen came over the hill, was complete enough to live in. Complete enough to sleep in. There is a shadow somewhere to the east, not yet visible from this corner of England. Not yet felt. But the autumn of the 13th century is later than it seems, and the warmth will not hold forever. The news comes before the sickness does. That is the thing no one quite prepares for. You hear it first from a peddler passing through, sometime in the late summer of 1348. He has come up from the south, moving fast, and he does not stay to water his horse the way peddlers usually do. He says something about the ports, about ships arriving in the wrong kind of silence, about a sickness that moves like weather, town to town, and does not seem to stop for anything. You watch him go. Then you go back to your work, because the beans still need pulling, and the barley does not care about what happens in Dorset. But the news keeps coming. A tinker the following week. Then a priest travelling to the next village over, hurrying on foot, who will not say much except that God is testing the faithful. Each person who passes your gate seems to be coming from somewhere worse than where they started. They do not linger. They do not eat at the table. They keep moving. And then, for a while, the road goes quiet. You notice the quiet before you notice the sickness. The cart that usually comes on market day does not come. The miller's boy, who always cuts across your southern strip on his way to the mill, has not been seen in a week. There is a stillness over the village that does not feel like peace. The air in the late summer is the same air it always is. Warm in the afternoon, cooler after dark, smelling of the harvested rye and the turned earth and the cow dung that has dried along the lane. The swallows still hunt the high insects in the evening. The village looks the same. Only it is quiet in a way that has a weight to it, a quality of something being held back, like the moment before a dog barks and then does not. You sleep lightly those nights. You hear the wind in the thatch and you lie in the dark and you think about nothing in particular, which is how you know that you are thinking about something. Morning comes and you rise and you start the fire and the kettle hangs on its hook and the day begins. But you have started checking the road when you go out to the yard. You are not sure what you expect to see. The first death is old William at the common's edge. He has been ailing all summer, and when the church bell rings for him, you think nothing of it beyond the usual sadness. The second death is his daughter. She was not ailing at all. After that, the bell rings often. So often, in those weeks, that it begins to lose its meaning. Each toll folding into the last, the sound spreading out over the fields and into the wood and dissolving there. Just sound now, just air moving. You stop counting. You stop listening for it. That is the strangest part. The passing bell was made to tell you that a soul has left the world, and somewhere along the way it becomes something you hear the way you hear rain. It rings and you go on salting the pork, or mending the hem, or stacking the kindling, because what else is there to do? The bell is ringing, and your hands are still your hands, and the work is still the work. The cottage to the east of yours goes empty. The family there, 4 of them, the mother, the father, the 2 young children whose names you knew, are gone inside a fortnight. The door hangs open. A pot rests on the hearthstone, still sooted from the last fire. The garden, 3 rows of leeks someone planted in April, keeps growing without anyone to tend it. You walk past that garden every morning. The leeks do not know. They push up broad and green in the September air, fatter each day, and there is no one to pull them and no one to eat them, and they will go to seed before winter, and none of it is the fault of anyone at all. You look at them, and then you look away and keep walking. One morning you stop and pull 3 of them, because it seems wrong to let them go to nothing. You carry them home and cook them that night, and they are good, as leeks always are in the autumn, sweet from the cold. You eat your supper and do not say anything about where they came from, and the fire is low and orange, and outside the owls are calling in the wood, and inside it is warm. You are alive. That fact, which you have never particularly noticed before, sits with you through the meal and into the dark. The strips in the open field begin to go untended. The whole rhythm of the agricultural year requires enough hands, and there are not enough hands. You look out in the morning and the land is the same land it has always been, but there is something wrong with the scale of it. It looks too large, too indifferent. The strips that belong to Edmund's family and Thomas's family and the widow Agnes lie in the September light, turned at the edges where they started the autumn ploughing and then stopped. The earth is broken there, open, and the rain that comes in October will fall into it and no one will come to work it down. A furrow left unfinished is a small and ordinary thing. In that year there are so many of them that they stop being small. You and the handful of your neighbours who are still able try to cover what you can. You rise before dawn and go out into the field and work until the light fails, and then you come home and eat whatever there is and sleep. The work is more than the hands available. You make decisions. This strip first, that one later, Agnes's strip not at all because it is too far and the season is too short. You carry those decisions with you. They are not comfortable. But they are practical, and the only alternative is to do nothing and let the whole field go, and you are not the kind of person who does nothing. The priest buries the dead for as long as he is able. Then the priest dies. A young cleric is sent from the deanery to cover 3 parishes at once, and he arrives thin and frightened and does his best, but he is one man with his breviary and a cart and roads that never seem to end. Some of the dead are buried quickly and with proper rite. Some are buried quickly and without. The distinction, in those months, begins to matter less than it once did. You carry on. Not because you feel strong. You do not particularly feel strong, but because the animals need feeding and the fire needs tending and life presses forward in its daily way, regardless of the size of what has happened. You milk the cow. You check the thatch where it was letting in water. You eat your supper by the fire and the fire crackles, and the night outside is the same night it always was, the stars in their old places, the wind off the hill. The cow does not know. She turns her head when you come in with the bucket, the same slow turn she always makes, and she lets you work and you work, and the milk comes down warm, and the steam rises off it in the cold morning air of the byre, and you are here, and she is here, and the world has not entirely stopped. There is something in the ordinariness of it that holds you. You cannot say what it is exactly. You do not try to say it. You just carry the bucket back across the yard and go inside and start the fire, and the day begins again. Historians still debate exactly how devastating the plague was in any given place. Estimates of English mortality range from 1/3 of the population to something closer to 1/2, and the truth almost certainly varied. From the densely packed port towns where it was catastrophic, to the scattered upland farms where a handful of families might have gone through without a single death. What we do know, reading across the manor court records and the bishop's registers and the long column of unfilled benefices, is that the absence is visible in the documents for decades afterward. The empty holdings. The repeated entries, no heir. The villages that simply do not appear in later tax records. Whether the plague alone caused the upheaval that followed, or whether it accelerated something already straining at its bonds, is a question scholars have been debating ever since. But now you are standing in what remains of your village in the winter of 1349, and the question is not abstract. You are still here. That is something. You walk through the village on a grey February morning and you count, without meaning to, the smoke from the chimneys. There used to be more smoke. The number you arrive at is not the number you remember. You stand in the lane for a moment, breath misting, and then you go on. There is a fence that needs mending before the sheep get into the barley ground again. The work does not stop. Spring comes, as it always comes. The birds are back in the hedges, noisy, indifferent to what the winter held. The green comes up out of the brown field, and the lambs appear on their knock-kneed legs, and the whole world insists on itself, on its own returning. There are not enough of you to do what was done before, and so certain things are not done. But the things that can be done are done, and the village that is left is still a village, still living, still getting up at first light and going to bed at dark. It is smaller than it was. It is still here. And something else is strange. After the worst has passed, after the bell rings less often and the roads begin to move again and the next spring arrives with its usual indifference, you discover that your labour is worth more than it has ever been. There are not enough people to work the land. The lords who own the manors need you more than they did before. For the first time in your memory, you can ask. You can walk away. You can go to the next manor and offer your hands at a higher rate, and they will take them, because the alternative is an unharvested field. The lords try to stop it. Parliament passes the Statute of Labourers in 1351, ordering wages to return to the old levels and workers to stay where they belong. The constables go out. Fines are levied. But the logic of supply and demand is older and more persistent than any statute, and everywhere the old arrangements creak under their own weight. Some villeins are still bound to their land, legally at least. But the legal reality and the daily reality are beginning to pull apart in ways the old system was not built to accommodate. You feel it in small ways. The way a landlord's steward speaks to you now. The small silence before he names a price. Something has shifted in the room that neither of you quite names. The loosening takes a generation. It is not clean and it is not swift, and for many people it does not come at all. The old bonds hold in plenty of places, and the men who hold them are not inclined to give them up without a fight. But by the time the poll tax comes, in 1381, and the collectors begin their rounds in Essex and Kent, something has been accumulating for 30 years. The resentment is not only about the tax, though the tax is what touches it off. It is about the gap between what the law says and what people have begun to believe about their own worth. For one strange season, ordinary people march. They come down the roads into London, tens of thousands of them, villeins and craftsmen and artisans, led by men whose names history has kept. Wat Tyler, John Ball, who preached that when Adam delved and Eve span, there was no gentleman. They frighten the powerful. The 14-year-old king meets them at Smithfield and makes promises that are not kept. The revolt is put down, and the leaders are killed, and the laws do not change, not immediately. But the powerful have been frightened. That stays. Something has been said that cannot quite be unsaid. The age that follows the plague is not simple. It is not a clean story of liberation. But it is different from the age before it, and the difference was written into it in the fields that went untended and the bells that rang until they stopped meaning anything. In the long silence of the road in that autumn of 1348, before anything had happened, when the news was travelling towards you and had not yet arrived. You rest now in that quiet between. The long wars ahead will take your sons, or your neighbours' sons, toward France. The dynasty will quarrel with itself across the next century. But for tonight, for this moment in the cooling year, you are warm enough, and the candle burns, and the world is still. Every man in England with a bow practices on Sunday. This is not custom, it is law. The village green, the church wall, the strip of common beside the mill. Wherever there is a length of flat ground, men and boys set up the targets after Mass and loose their arrows through the afternoon. It starts when you are young enough to barely draw the cord, a small bow cut to your height, and continues until your arms are strong enough that the left side of your body develops differently from the right. The asymmetry is visible in the skeletons. An archer's left arm grows more heavily built and more robust than his right from years of that pull, and if you could line up the men of a 15th century English village and examine their bones, you would see the mark of it in most of the men over 20. The bow is what England has. France is larger and richer and more populous, and the long wars that stretch across the 14th and 15th centuries are, from the French point of view, a matter of defending that wealth. From the English point of view, looking up from your strip of field, the wars are a more immediate and personal thing. They are a matter of whether your brother or your husband or your eldest son comes home. The muster comes to a village like yours, not as an abstraction, but as a man with a list. He comes from the county, and he wants archers, men who can draw to the standard, men who own their own bow and a sheaf of arrows, and a reasonable chance of surviving the crossing. Some men go willingly. The pay is better than anything available at home, and there are stories, at least, of what veterans brought back from France: silver plate, good cloth, a French sword that hung for years above the hearth in a farmhouse in Somerset until no one remembered quite where it came from. Others go less willingly, and some do not come back. The women left behind manage. They always manage. They take on the strips that need tending, negotiate with the miller, keep the rent paid, write letters if they can write, or have them written if they cannot. The waiting is a specific kind of work, requiring its own discipline. The rhythm of your days does not change in its outlines. You rise before full light. You tend whatever needs tending, the fire, the animals, the youngest child still sleeping in the corner under the blanket. The day fills itself. At evening you sit by the hearth and the fire talks to itself in its low way, and outside the window the dark comes down. You do not talk about the waiting much. It lives somewhere behind your breastbone, a small, persistent weight, and you carry it the way you carry most things, quietly and from habit. The garden still needs doing. The peas need tying before they fall over, and the kale needs the caterpillars picked off, and there is always something. You do it because it needs doing and because it fills the hands, and filled hands are a mercy when the mind wants to go somewhere it should not. The children are growing. The eldest one is old enough to help with the weeding now, and you work side by side in the late afternoon, not talking much, the sun on your backs, the dirt under your nails, the smell of the turned earth around you. This is a good hour. You do not name it that while it is happening. You know it later. The other women in the village have the same weight behind their eyes. You do not discuss it often. But when you meet at the well or the church door or in the lane coming back from the mill, there is a recognition, a kind of shorthand that does not need words. You nod. You ask after the children. You go on. This is how the village carries itself through the years of the French wars, by continuing, by filling the days, by not looking too long at the empty place at the table. Agincourt happens in October 1415, and if you are in your village when the news comes back, weeks later, by the time it filters through the county, what you hear is not the tactical shape of the engagement, but rather that the English won and that fewer men were lost than anyone expected given the numbers. There is relief in that. There may be a man or two you were waiting to hear about. The battle itself, the mud, the French cavalry, the long morning of it, is not what you receive. You receive the outcome, simplified by distance. The one who comes home, changed in a way that is hard to name. He sits by the fire at night and looks at the floor. He goes back to work. There is no choice. The strips do not tend themselves. But sometimes he stops in the middle of a furrow and stands there with the plough handle in his hands and does not move. You learn not to ask what he is seeing. You put his supper in front of him and sit across from him, and the fire is between you and the evening passes. The children treat him carefully at first, the way children treat a dog whose moods they have not yet learned. Then one morning the youngest climbs into his lap without thinking about it, because children do not think about things the way adults do. They just do them, and he does not move for a moment, and then he puts his arm around her, and that is that. It is not all at once, but it is a beginning. The evenings by the fire are what they are, quiet, a little careful, the words chosen with some small attention, and gradually, season by season, something settles back into place. Not what was there before. Something new, made from what came back and what stayed in the time between. You sit close to the fire, your hands loose in your lap, and for the moment there is nothing required of you but to be here, in the same room, in the warmth. The wars drag on past Agincourt, past Henry V himself, who dies in France in 1422 before his son is old enough to speak. They drag on through a long regency, through the slow unravelling of the English position in France across the 1430s and 1440s, through the final loss of Normandy and Gascony in the early 1450s after more than a century of English kings calling themselves King of France. What that loss means in your village is mostly that the soldiers stop coming home with French things. The traffic slows. The occasional traveller who used to bring news from the ports brings different news now. News of withdrawal, of armies reduced and ships idle. The war, without knowing it, is ending. And then, before the relief is quite settled, the trouble begins closer to home. The historians who study the later 15th century have a name for the dynastic quarrel that splits the English aristocracy across the second half of that century. And the name is beautiful in the way that names given long after the fact often are, the Wars of the Roses. Two branches of the old royal house, Lancaster, York, manoeuvring for the crown across decades of shifting alliances and periodic battles and assassinations conducted with the cold efficiency that medieval politics allowed. For the dukes and earls and their retinues, these decades are consequential and often fatal. For you, in your village, they are mostly weather. The battles happen in specific places on specific days, and unless your particular corner of England is in the path of a marching army, which it may or may not be, depending on where you live, the daily rhythm of your life is not much interrupted by the dynastic question. You plant in spring. You harvest in late summer. The lord who holds your manor may change, may be attainted, may lose his head after one of the several battles, and his replacement arrives with different personnel, but largely the same set of demands. The rent is still due at Michaelmas. The mill still needs the grain. A marching army is not a comfortable thing to have pass through your parish. They eat what they find and they move on. And what they leave behind is a larder that is lighter than you would like, and a yard that needs cleaning, and a gate that somebody kicked off its hinges for firewood. You repair what can be repaired. You are not the first person to have had soldiers through, and you will not be the last. Afterward, the quiet seems large and somehow kind. This is not to say the conflict left no marks. In the regions where the armies actually moved through, there was real damage, real disruption, real fear in the towns that lay in the way. But the image of England engulfed in civil war across these decades is, scholars have argued, somewhat misleading. The fighting was intermittent. Long stretches passed in relative quiet. The countryside was not burning continuously. It is worth sitting with that plainness for a moment. The most dramatic sounding chapter in English history was, for most people in most places, something that happened to other people in fields they had never seen, for reasons they could only partly follow. What they could follow, more clearly, was the slow change happening in the texture of daily life. You are in your own yard while all of this passes. The lane quiet this morning, the oak by the gate unchanged, the particular smell of the season on the air, your breath visible in the cold. A printed book appears in England in 1476. A man named William Caxton sets up a press at Westminster and begins producing volumes that look like manuscripts but were made by a machine, reproducible, consistent, each copy nearly identical to the last. The first books are expensive, intended for wealthy buyers. But the fact of them, the sheer fact that a book can now be made in quantity, that a single text need not be copied by hand one letter at a time by a monk in a scriptorium, is something that will not be undone. Knowledge is beginning to move differently. It will take generations to feel the full weight of this, but the weight has arrived. No printing press in your cottage, no handbill tacked to the church door. But somewhere, not far, a press is moving. And in the market town, a man who used to copy receipts by hand has heard about it and is thinking. The open fields are changing too. Here and there, across the Midlands and the South, the old strips are beginning to be consolidated, the shared commons beginning to be enclosed by hedges that cut what was common into what is private. The economics of wool have been pulling at the old system for a long time. A flock of sheep grazing enclosed land requires far fewer hands than the same acreage under arable, and a lord with enough leverage can clear the strips and put up the hedges and dismiss the village in a generation. It does not happen everywhere at once. It happens farm by farm, manor by manor, decade by decade, in the quiet way that most large changes happen, not as an event but as an accumulation of smaller events that one day you look back on and realize were a single transformation. The hedge goes up at the manor beyond the wood and you note it and you keep going, because your own strips are still yours and the season does not wait. There are families who lose their strips to the enclosure and have nowhere clear to go. They drift toward the towns, toward the roads, toward whatever chance offers itself. The village notices their departure the way it notices most departures, quietly, practically, with a kind of grief held at arm's length because there is too much to do to hold it closer. A cottage stands empty. Its thatch begins to sag. The nettles come up around the doorstep and then over it. In 20 years there will be a hollow in the ground where the floor was, and the nettles will be tall, and people will walk past without remembering what stood there. The landscape itself is being rewritten. The open strips that have defined the view from your door since before anyone living can remember. The long, narrow runs of each family's holding, open to the shared sky, grazed by the shared animals on the stubble after harvest, are being drawn into themselves, bordered, closed. Where there was common, there is hedge. Where there was shared, there is a name on a document in a chest in a house you are not invited into. The change is not dramatic. It is just persistent. It is just there each morning when you look out, a little more than the morning before. Where the Middle Ages end is itself a question historians have been debating for centuries. No date is quite right. 1485, when the last Plantagenet king dies at Bosworth and the first Tudor begins. That is a clean number, a syllable in the story that all the textbooks can agree on. But the life in your village does not end with Henry Tudor's accession. The mill is still there. The strips are still there, mostly. The church is still there, the same grey stone it has always been. Your grandmother's grandmother was born in something very like this village, and your granddaughter may be born in something very like it too. And yet, something is ending. You can feel it in the printed pages travelling slowly out of London, in the hedges going up at the manor beyond the wood, in the way young men talk now about London, about possibilities, about a world slightly larger than the one their fathers knew. The candle has burned very low. The fire is settling toward coals. The long Middle Ages, 1,000 years of kings and harvests and prayers and ploughing, of plague and birth and market day and the slow turning of the liturgical year, are folding into something new, something that does not yet have a name. You rest now in the cooling quiet of it. The age is closing like a book being gently closed. The darkness is warm. 1,000 years have passed, and the candle beside you has barely burned down. You have walked through the long middle of the world. You have stood in the shadow of a Roman wall while the legions withdrew. You have watched the Saxons plant their fields and build their churches and give names to places that still carry those names today. You have sheltered in a Norman keep and ploughed the open strips and ground your grain at the miller's wheel. You have heard the bell ring for the dead and watched the survivors look up, blinking into a world that needed them more than it ever had. You have sat by hearths that looked very much like this one. All of that is behind you now. The long centuries have passed the way sleep passes, not as nothing, but as warmth, as movement too slow to notice, as a gradual darkening and softening at the edges of the room. You are warm enough. You have always been warm enough, at the last. The blanket is there, the one you pulled around you at the beginning, and it is still there, still heavy, still kind. The darkness has folded itself around you the way it folded around every person in every century you have just travelled through. The same darkness, the same rest, the same quiet at the end of the day. There is nothing left to tend tonight. The field can wait. The fire is low, the coals fading from orange to red to the deep grey that means morning is a long way off. Sleep now. Dream of the Saxon village at first light, the wood smoke going straight up into a still sky. Dream of the open field in August, the grain heavy, your hands moving through it. Dream of the road going south, the willows leaning over it, the dust of a long summer caught in the last of the afternoon. The darkness holds. The night holds. You are here, you are held, you are resting. Sleep now. Rest well.